In 1943, American bomber gunners were trained to wait. That single instruction killed thousands of men. The math was perfect, the manuals were precise, and the survival rate kept collapsing. One young tail gunner realized the problem wasn't his aim. It was timing. He fired before he was allowed to. Not to hit anything, but to take control. What followed wasn't a lucky mission, or a heroic exception. It was a quiet change that rewrote how bombers survived the war. This is the story of how breaking one rule in the sky saved hundreds of lives, and why following it had been killing them all along. Want more stories about the hidden decisions that shaped World War II? Consider subscribing. These are the lessons history rarely explains but never forgets. In 1943, the United States Army Air Forces believed they had solved the problem of bomber defense. On paper, the logic was flawless. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were designed as self-defending machines. 13 .50 caliber machine guns covered nearly every angle of approach. Tight formations, concentrated firepower, overlapping fields of fire into lethal boxes in the sky. Enemy fighters, the theory went, would be shredded before they could inflict serious damage. The doctrine was simple. Discipline wins survival. Every aerial gunner was trained to follow the same rule. Do not fire too early. Wait until the enemy enters the optimal range between 400 and 600 yards. Aim carefully. Fire controlled bursts. Anything else was considered wasteful, unprofessional, and dangerous. The manuals insisted that accuracy mattered more than aggression. Ammunition was limited. Barrels could overheat. Random firing at long range only revealed positions and accomplished nothing. Gunnery instructors repeated the same lesson to hundreds of thousands of young men. Wait for the perfect shot. And yet, bomber crews kept dying. By mid-1943, the statistics were impossible to ignore. American bombers flying over occupied Europe were being destroyed at a rate that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. Entire formations were torn apart before reaching their targets. Aircraft returned riddled with holes if they returned at all. The problem was not courage. It was not effort. And it was not mechanical failure. It was timing. German fighter pilots had learned the system. They understood the American rules as well as the Americans did. They knew exactly when bomber gunners were trained to open fire and, more importantly, when they were not. So they attacked before the gunners were ready. Head-on passes came screaming in at closing speeds no training range could simulate. Attacks from below exploited blind spots and reaction delays. Even tail approaches, the most dangerous route, were timed so that German pilots could begin firing before American gunners were supposed to respond. By the time a bomber gunner saw a fighter reach regulation range, the bomber was already absorbing damage. The doctrine assumed a fair exchange. Combat did not provide one. In theory, bomber defense was built on precision. In reality, it was built on hesitation. The Air Forces responded the only way institutions know how, by reinforcing the rules. More training, more emphasis on discipline, more insistence that gunners trust the mathematics and ignore what their instincts told them. But the numbers continued to worsen. During the worst months of 1943, bomber loss rates reached levels that bordered on unsustainable. Crews began to understand the grim arithmetic of their own survival. At existing loss rates, many bomber units would be destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Entire air campaigns were at risk of collapse. Still, the doctrine remained untouched, because doctrine, once written, carries authority. And authority resists contradiction. The system could accept losses. What it could not accept was the idea that it was wrong. The manuals had been written by experts. The training programs were built by professionals. Changing them would mean admitting that thousands of men had been trained incorrectly and that those mistakes had cost lives. So, the rules stayed in place. Bomber crews were told to trust the system, even as the system failed them mission after mission. What no one at headquarters wanted to confront was this uncomfortable truth. The doctrine had been designed for ideal conditions, not real combat. It assumed calm gunners, stable platforms, perfect visibility, and predictable enemy behavior. None of those conditions existed at 25,000 feet, in freezing air, inside vibrating aluminum aircraft, while enemy fighters closed in at hundreds of miles per hour. The system worked in classrooms. It failed in the sky. And somewhere in that gap between theory and reality, between what the manuals demanded and what survival required, a realization was forming not in a planning office or a training command, but in the mind of a single tail gunner staring down incoming fighters. Come to understand something the doctrine could not. That in air combat, control mattered more than accuracy. That hesitation was deadlier than wasted ammunition. And that waiting for permission to fire was the most dangerous decision of all. The doctrine wasn't born from ignorance. It was born from mathematics. Every rule bomber gunners followed came from careful calculation. Ballistics tables, lead angles, time of flight equations, training manuals built on numbers that, in isolation, were correct. If a fighter approached at a known speed, and a bullet traveled at a known velocity, then there was an optimal distance at which the probability of a hit peaked. That distance was 400 to 600 yards. On a chalkboard, the logic was unassailable. At that range, the bullet's flight time was short enough to limit target movement, yet far enough to allow the gunner time to track and aim. Fire earlier, the math said, and hit probability collapsed. Fire later, and the target passed too quickly to engage. The solution was elegant, precise, and repeatable. It was also detached from reality. The mathematics assumed a world without fear. They assumed a gunner who could think clearly while the aircraft shook violently in turbulence. A gunner who could calculate deflection while oxygen lines froze and fingers went numb. A gunner who could calmly apply theory while cannon shells punched through aluminum skin around him. They assumed a stable platform, a predictable target, and a mind free to compute. Combat offered none of those things. At altitude, bombers were anything but steady. Slipstreams buffeted tail positions, engines vibrated constantly. Visibility shifted by the second as clouds, smoke, and glare interfered with depth perception. Even small errors in distance estimation multiplied into complete misses. Worse still, the doctrine assumed time. Time to observe, time to aim, time to fire. German fighter pilots did not grant that luxury. By the time a bomber gunner identified an incoming fighter and confirmed it was within authorized range, the enemy pilot had often already fired. The bomber absorbed damage before the gunner ever touched the trigger. The math optimized for accuracy. The enemy optimized for initiative. That mismatch proved fatal. Training ranges did not simulate what it felt like to be hunted. They did not replicate the psychological pressure of watching multiple aircraft close in simultaneously, knowing that every second of delay increased the odds of death, not just for the gunner, but for the entire crew. Under those conditions, precision degraded. Fine motor control vanished. Perfect deflection angles became approximations. And approximations, at high speed, missed. The doctrine responded by doubling down. Gunnery instructors insisted the solution was more discipline, not less. More trust in training. More obedience to the numbers. But numbers alone cannot account for human behavior. A fighter pilot attacking a bomber does not simply fly a straight line into gunfire. He adjusts, he weaves, he waits for hesitation. He studies defensive patterns and exploits them. German pilots learned that American gunners waited. They learned that the guns stayed silent until a specific moment, and that silence gave them confidence. Confidence to line up shots. Confidence to hold steady during the most dangerous seconds of an attack run. In effect, the doctrine taught enemy pilots exactly when they were safest. The math never accounted for that. It treated the enemy as a moving target, not a thinking one. This was the fundamental flaw. The equations measured bullets and distances, but they ignored psychology. They calculated trajectories, but not fear. They optimized for theoretical hits, not real-world outcomes. The result was a system that looked scientific while quietly failing. Bomber formations bristled with guns, yet their defensive fire arrived too late to matter. Crews followed every rule, trusted every calculation, and still watched neighboring aircraft disintegrate in midair. From the perspective of command, nothing appeared broken. The numbers checked out. The manuals aligned with the data. Any deviation from doctrine looked irresponsible. From the perspective of the men inside the aircraft, the truth was obvious. Waiting was killing them. The problem was not that the math was wrong. It was that the math described a world that did not exist. In the sky over Europe, combat was chaotic, human, and unforgiving. Survival depended less on perfect solutions and more on forcing the enemy to react. Accuracy mattered, but only after control had been established. Control, the doctrine had never taught them, could not be calculated on a firing range. It had to be taken. Realization did not come during a dramatic firefight. It came during the quiet. Between missions, bomber crews existed in a strange limbo. They cleaned weapons that might never be used again. They patched holes from the last mission, while trying not to imagine the next one. They replayed moments in their heads, angles, distances, seconds, searching for mistakes that might explain why others hadn't come back. This was where the doctrine unraveled. A tail gunner began to notice a pattern that training had never prepared him to see. Each engagement followed the same rhythm. German fighters assembled at a distance, just beyond effective fire. They approached with confidence, knowing exactly when the guns behind them would come alive. And every time, the same thought surfaced. By the time I'm allowed to shoot, I'm already losing. The manuals framed combat as a problem of precision, weight, aim, fire. But combat did not pause politely while those steps unfolded. Enemy pilots were already firing before the crosshairs aligned. They were already dictating the tempo of the fight. The gunner wasn't late because he was slow. He was late because the rules demanded it. The more he watched, the clearer it became. Hits weren't the issue. Even when gunners fired at the correct range, the odds of scoring decisive hits were small. Less than 2% of rounds struck attacking fighters. That number wasn't improving, no matter how disciplined the crews became. So why did the rules insist on waiting? Because waiting preserved the illusion of control. On a training range, waiting made sense. Targets moved predictably. Time existed. Shots could be evaluated and corrected. The doctrine rewarded patience because nothing punished it. In combat, patience was punished immediately. The insight that followed was deceptively simple. What if the goal wasn't to hit first? What if the goal was to disrupt first? The manuals treated firing as a single event, a burst intended to destroy the enemy aircraft. But real engagements weren't single events. They were processes. Attack runs that required stability, confidence, and timing. A fighter pilot needed a few uninterrupted seconds to line up his shot. Take those seconds away, and the entire attack unraveled. Early fire wouldn't increase hit probability. Everyone knew that. The math made that clear. But early fire could do something else entirely. It could deny the enemy a clean approach. It could force evasive movement. It could introduce hesitation where confidence had existed seconds earlier. In other words, it could shift control. This was the moment the rules stopped making sense. The doctrine assumed that firing was reactive. The gunner responded to the enemy's move. But what if firing became proactive? What if the gunner dictated the terms instead? The idea was not heroic. It was practical. If German pilots expected silence until a certain distance, then silence was a vulnerability. And if they expected disciplined bursts, then aggression itself became a weapon. The risk was obvious. Firing early consumed ammunition. It heated barrels. It violated everything the gunner had been taught. If it failed, the consequences would be immediate and personal. But waiting had consequences too, and those consequences were already known. The difference was psychological. Waiting felt safe because it followed the rules. Acting early felt dangerous because it broke them. Yet the gunner understood something the manuals could not teach. Rules only protected you if the enemy respected them, and the enemy did not. This was not a rebellion against authority. It was an adjustment to reality. He wasn't trying to outshoot the fighter. He was trying to unsettle the pilot flying it. If early fire forced an attacker to flinch, even once, the geometry of the attack changed. If it broke formation, the threat multiplied less effectively. If it forced hesitation, survival odds improved not by precision, but by disruption. The doctrine had been asking gunners to wait for certainty. Combat rewarded uncertainty imposed on the enemy. This understanding did not feel revolutionary. It felt obvious once seen. And that was the most unsettling part. The insight had been there all along, hidden in plain sight, overlooked because it did not fit the equations. The gunner did not see himself as clever. He saw himself as tired of watching others die. The next mission would test whether that understanding was insight or illusion, not in theory, not in debate, but in the thin air behind a bomber, with enemy fighters closing in and no margin left for waiting. The first time he broke the rule, nothing dramatic happened. There was no immediate confirmation of success, no explosion, no falling enemy aircraft spiraling toward the ground, just gunfire earlier than anyone expected, cutting through the thin air behind the bomber. At long range, the tracers looked almost harmless. They arced outward, fading before reaching their targets. To anyone trained by the book, it looked like waste, noise without effect, ammunition disappearing into empty sky. But something changed. The approaching fighters did not continue as planned. Instead of pressing straight in, they began to adjust. Small movements at first, a slight bank, a climb, a correction that wasn't part of the original attack profile. Those changes were subtle, but in air combat, subtle changes mattered. The gunner was no longer reacting. He was forcing decisions. A fighter pilot attacking a bomber depended on rhythm. He needed to line up, stabilize, fire, and break away all within a narrow window. That window existed only if the bomber's guns remained quiet long enough for confidence to settle in. Early fire shattered that rhythm. The tracers arrived before the pilot expected resistance, before he had fully committed, before he had achieved the calm required to hold his aircraft steady under fire. Instinct took over. Hands tightened. Corrections multiplied. The smooth geometry of the attack collapsed into improvisation. Accuracy was no longer the deciding factor. Control was. The gunner kept firing as the distance closed. Not in short, measured bursts, but in sustained streams. The doctrine warned against this. Overheating barrels, wasted rounds, reduced discipline. But discipline was meaningless if it preserved the enemy's initiative. As the fighters pressed closer, they were no longer executing clean attack runs. They were flying through a space already filled with fire that had been there long enough to deny them a stable approach. The bomber's tail was no longer a passive target. It was a zone of resistance. Some fighters broke away early. Others hesitated just long enough to lose their advantage. Those that continued found themselves entering a fight already tilted against them. At closer ranges, the hit probability increased not because the gunner's aim had improved, but because the enemy's approach had degraded. Their angles were worse. Their timing was off. Their confidence was fractured. This was the effect the manuals had never measured. Early fire did not kill fighters at long range. It killed attacks before they matured. And that distinction mattered. What looked like reckless aggression was, in reality, a deliberate shift in dynamics. The gunner was no longer trying to win by precision alone. He was imposing uncertainty on the enemy, forcing pilots to make decisions earlier under worse conditions, with less control. In air combat, uncertainty favors defense. The gunner's crew noticed the difference immediately. Attacks felt less coordinated. The pressure eased, if only slightly. Seconds that once felt endless now passed without impact. The bomber still took fire, but not with the same intensity or precision. Survival was no longer a matter of waiting for the perfect shot. It became a matter of denying the enemy a perfect moment. From the outside, nothing about the bomber had changed. Same aircraft, same guns, same ammunition, same crews. The difference was invisible, a decision made seconds earlier than doctrine allowed. But that decision cascaded outward. German pilots adapted quickly, but adaptation cost them. Each aborted run consumed fuel, time, and nerve. Each disrupted attack reduced the effectiveness of coordinated strikes. Aggressive defensive fire did not need to destroy every attacker. It only needed to make the attack costly enough to reconsider. The gunner understood this intuitively. He was not fighting the aircraft. He was fighting the pilot's confidence. This reframing changed everything. The doctrine measured success by confirmed kills. The gunner measured success by attacks that never fully formed. The manuals valued restraint. Combat rewarded pressure. Accuracy still mattered, but only after initiative had been seized. The old system treated gunners as reactive components in a larger machine. Fire when instructed, stop when told. Trust the system, Reality demanded something else. It demanded judgment. The gunner learned when to open fire based not on distance alone, but on enemy behavior, formation patterns, closure rates, intent. He read the sky the way hunters read terrain, not through equations, but through experience. This was not chaos. It was adaptation. And adaptation spread. Other gunners noticed. They began firing earlier, too cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. They saw the same effects: fighters breaking off, attacks losing cohesion, bombers surviving encounters that once would have destroyed them. The shift was subtle, but its consequences were not. What the system had framed as indiscipline was, in fact, a new form of control, one the manuals had never anticipated. By refusing to wait, the gunners reclaimed the initiative. By imposing pressure, they forced the enemy to respond. And in the air war of 1943, response time was the difference between survival and loss. Accuracy could win a moment. Control could win a mission. Success in combat does not automatically translate into acceptance. In fact, it often does the opposite. The moment the results became visible, resistance followed. Not from the enemy, but from within. What had worked in the sky now collided with a system built on rules, hierarchy, and institutional certainty. The problem was not that early aggressive fire failed. The problem was that it succeeded for the wrong reasons. From the perspective of command, bomber defense was a technical discipline. It relied on standardization, uniform training, predictable outcomes. The idea that one gunner could simply decide to fire earlier and be right threatened the entire structure. If he was right, then the manuals were wrong. And if the manuals were wrong, the consequences extended far beyond a single aircraft. Training commands had invested enormous resources into teaching doctrine. Hundreds of thousands of gunners had been trained to wait. Entire schools existed to enforce that discipline. To admit error now would mean admitting that countless crews had followed flawed guidance into combat. Institutions do not make that admission easily. Reports of unusual success were met with skepticism. 4 fighters destroyed in a single mission? Impossible. Bomber gunners did not achieve those numbers. Not according to the data. Not according to precedent. The explanation, when it came, was predictable. Luck. Perhaps the enemy pilots had made mistakes. Perhaps the gun camera footage was misleading. Perhaps confirmation bias was at work. One anomalous mission did not justify rewriting doctrine. From the safety of headquarters, early fire looked irresponsible. Ammunition expenditure doubled. Barrel wear increased. Theoretical hit probability decreased. Every chart pointed in the wrong direction. The system was defending its logic. But logic alone does not survive contact with data. Operational commanders saw what the charts did not. They saw aircraft returning that should not have. Crews surviving engagements that once ended in disaster. Patterns forming where none were expected. More importantly, they saw a change in enemy behavior. German fighters were still attacking, but differently. Less confidently, less aggressively. Attacks broke off earlier. Formations hesitated. The sky felt, if not safer, then less hopeless. That difference mattered. Yet the debate hardened. To the training establishment, early fire was a dangerous precedent. If one rule could be broken, what stopped others? Discipline depended on obedience, not interpretation. War, in their view, required control from the top down. But combat was not happening in classrooms. The men flying missions did not argue in abstractions. They argued in losses, in empty bunks, in crews that failed to return. For them, doctrine was not sacred. Survival was. The tension exposed a deeper conflict. The system valued consistency. Combat demanded adaptation. The manuals were designed to create average performance across thousands of men. But survival did not depend on averages. It depended on margins, small advantages gained in moments of chaos. Early aggressive fire existed in those margins. What made the situation explosive was not just that the rule had been broken, but that it could not be easily categorized. It was not a new weapon, not a modification to aircraft, not a formal tactical doctrine. It was judgment exercised by individuals under pressure, and judgment cannot be standardized. that frightened institutions built on control. Arguments raged in briefing rooms far from the sound of gunfire. Charts were produced, loss rates debated, assumptions defended. Every side claimed the numbers supported them. But the battlefield kept voting. As more gunners quietly adopted early fire, the pattern repeated. Not spectacular kill counts, but fewer catastrophic losses. Bombers came home damaged, but intact. Crews survived missions that once destroyed entire formations. These outcomes forced a question the system could not avoid. If waiting was safer, why were those who waited dying more often? No doctrine survives that question indefinitely. Still, change came slowly, carefully, wrapped in cautious language. Early fire was not declared correct. It was authorized under certain conditions. Aggression was reframed as situational discretion. Manuals were not rewritten overnight, they were adjusted, quietly, to preserve institutional dignity. No one publicly admitted that the rule had been deadly, but in practice, it was abandoned. This was not a triumph for one man. It was a reluctant concession by a system confronted with evidence it could no longer ignore. The data did not argue. It accumulated. Loss rates declined. Enemy attacks degraded. Survival improved. And with each mission, the old certainty eroded. The conflict revealed something uncomfortable about war itself. Systems are designed for predictability. Combat destroys predictability. When those realities collide, survival belongs to those closest to the problem, not those farthest from it. The early fire technique was never about heroism. It was about refusing to let procedure override perception. It was about recognizing when a rule no longer served its purpose. The system resisted not because it was malicious, but because it was built to preserve itself. In the end, the sky delivered the verdict. The rule had been defended. The rule had been tested. And the rule had failed. What replaced it was not chaos, but a quieter understanding. That sometimes the difference between life and death is not better accuracy, better equipment, or better training. It is the willingness to act before permission arrives. Institutions can dismiss anecdotes. They struggle to dismiss patterns. As the months passed, the effects of early aggressive fire stopped looking like coincidence. Reports began to stack up, not dramatic claims of individual heroics, but something far more troubling for the old doctrine: consistency. Bombers whose gunners fired early were surviving at higher rates. Not perfectly, not safely, but measurably. The change was not immediate, and it was not uniform. Some crews adopted the approach cautiously, others rejected it entirely. But across squadrons, where early fire spread informally, the same indicators began to appear. Enemy fighters broke off sooner. Attack runs became less coordinated. Damage still occurred, but catastrophic losses declined. For the first time, the numbers were moving in the right direction. This forced analysts to confront an uncomfortable reality. The doctrine they had trusted was optimized for a variable that mattered less than they believed. Hit probability had dominated every calculation, every chart, every training syllabus. But survival was not governed by hit probability alone. It was governed by behavior. When intelligence officers began comparing after-action reports, a new pattern emerged. The most important change was not the number of fighters destroyed. It was the number of attacks that never fully developed. Engagements ended earlier. Enemy pilots disengaged at greater distances. Bombers faced fewer sustained attack runs during critical moments of a mission. Losses declined, not because bombers were suddenly more lethal, but because they were less vulnerable. This distinction mattered. The old doctrine treated combat as an exchange of fire. Whoever aimed better won. The emerging data suggested something different. Combat was an interaction, a psychological contest layered on top of physics. And in that contest, initiative carried disproportionate weight. Early fire shifted initiative. German pilots, like all pilots, operated within a mental framework. They assessed risk continuously. They relied on predictable patterns. When those patterns broke, confidence eroded. Attacks became cautious. Caution reduced effectiveness. This was not speculation. It was observable. After-action reports from the German side, captured and analyzed later, hinted at the same phenomenon. Increased defensive fire at extended ranges, was forcing pilots to abort attacks prematurely. Newer pilots were especially affected. The psychological cost of pressing through early fire proved higher than anticipated. The manuals had never modeled that. As the data accumulated, resistance weakened, not because anyone admitted error, but because denial became impractical. Loss rates told their own story. In periods where early aggressive fire became more common, bomber losses to fighters dropped significantly. The decline was not absolute. Other factors mattered: improved formations, better coordination, and eventually, long-range fighter escorts would change the balance of the air war entirely. But the timing was clear. Before those escorts arrived in force, bomber survival had already begun to improve. Something inside the system had changed. Quietly, guidance shifted. Training materials began to soften their language. Gunners were no longer instructed to wait rigidly for a specific distance. Instead, they were told to engage as tactically appropriate. Judgment was acknowledged cautiously as a factor. No press release announced the change. No doctrine was publicly overturned. The system adapted without admitting why. But in practice, the rule that had once governed bomber defense lost its authority. The data had spoken. The significance of this shift extended beyond one technique. It exposed a deeper flaw in how modern warfare was being understood. Complex systems were being optimized around measurable variables, while ignoring harder-to-measure human responses. Accuracy was measurable. Fear was not. Initiative was not. Hesitation was not. Yet those factors shaped outcomes just as decisively. The early fire technique succeeded because it targeted the enemy's decision-making cycle. It forced pilots to react sooner than planned, under worse conditions, with less confidence. That disruption cascaded through every stage of an attack. Once analysts framed the problem that way, the results made sense. The system had not been failing because gunners were bad shots. It had been failing because it ceded control too early. The numbers confirmed what combat experience had suggested all along. Survival improved when defenders acted first, even if those actions were imperfect. Imperfect pressure beat perfect hesitation. By late 1943, the question was no longer whether early aggressive fire worked. The question was how many lives had been lost before the system allowed itself to see it. Estimates varied, but the implications were sobering. Even small reductions in loss rates translated into hundreds of crews surviving missions they would otherwise not have. Hundreds of aircraft returned. Hundreds of families received letters instead of telegrams. And none of it came from new technology. No new aircraft. No new weapons. No breakthrough in ballistics. Just a change in when a trigger was pulled. This was the lesson the numbers delivered, stripped of drama and heroism. War does not reward perfect adherence to rules designed in isolation. It rewards systems that adapt to human behavior under pressure. The doctrine had been elegant. The reality had been brutal. When the two collided, the numbers made the choice unavoidable. Early engagement did not guarantee victory. It simply made survival more likely. And in a war measured in attrition, that was enough to change everything. The impact of the change did not announce itself with celebration. There were no victory parades for bomber gunners. No public acknowledgement that a deadly rule had been abandoned. No official moment when the system paused to count the lives it had nearly lost. Instead, the effect revealed itself quietly. In missions that should have ended in disaster, bombers came home. Aircraft returned with damaged engines, shredded control surfaces, and holes punched clean through their fuselages, but they returned. Crews climbed out, exhausted, shaken, and alive. Those outcomes rarely made headlines. Survival did not look dramatic. It looked ordinary. A crew walking away from a plane that should not have landed. Empty bunks that were no longer empty. Formations that reassembled after attacks instead of vanishing into smoke. This was the true consequence of the shift. The early aggressive fire technique did not transform bomber crews into aces. It did not suddenly reverse the balance of air power. What it did was more subtle and far more important. It bought time. Time for damaged aircraft to limp home. Time for crews to regroup. Time for rescue boats to reach ditching crews in the channel. In air warfare, time was survival. The men who benefited from this change often never knew why. New gunners arriving in theater were taught revised guidance without explanation. They learned to fire earlier because that was now considered acceptable, not because someone explained the blood-soaked lessons that led there. They followed rules that had already been rewritten by experience. Behind those rules were hundreds of stories that never entered official records. Crews who completed missions they would not have survived months earlier. Families who never learned how close they came to receiving a telegram instead of a letter. Statistics captured trends, they did not capture relief. For the gunners themselves, the psychological shift was profound. No longer trapped in rigid procedure, they regained a sense of agency. They were no longer waiting for permission to defend themselves. They were making decisions based on what they saw, not what they had memorized. That change mattered. Men fight differently when they believe their actions can influence outcomes. Confidence returned, not reckless confidence, but the belief that survival was not entirely left to chance or distant planners. German pilots noticed as well. Attacks grew less aggressive, especially among newer pilots. After-action reports described increased defensive fire at extended ranges. That phrase, dry and technical, concealed its meaning. Attacking bomber formations now required greater nerve. The cost of pressing home an attack had risen. This did not end the air war, but it shifted its character. The skies became more contested, less predictable, more dangerous for both sides. And in that uncertainty, the bomber crews gained something they had been losing for months: margin. The greatest irony of the change was how invisible it remained. History remembers turning points marked by battles and commanders. It rarely remembers adjustments in procedure that quietly save lives. Yet those adjustments often matter more. The men who survived because of early aggressive fire did not see themselves as beneficiaries of innovation. They saw themselves as lucky. They went home, they married, they worked ordinary jobs. The war faded into memory. But their survival was not luck alone. It was the result of a system, reluctantly and imperfectly, learning from those closest to danger. The doctrine had not been rewritten by theory. It had been rewritten by loss. Every improved statistic represented a story that did not end in smoke and water. Every reduced loss rate meant aircraft that returned, crews that endured, and families that remained whole. Those outcomes did not fit neatly into training manuals. They existed in the spaces between columns of data, and that was where their value lay. By the time long-range fighter escorts arrived in force and shifted the air war decisively, bomber defense had already evolved. The gunners were no longer passive participants in their own survival. They were actors, shaping engagements rather than absorbing them. This legacy was not celebrated, it was absorbed. Aircraft, new theaters, and new generations of airmen inherited principles forged in 1943 without knowing their origin. The idea that defenders should engage early, disrupt attacks, and deny the enemy clean execution became standard not because it was elegant, but because it worked. The lives saved were never fully counted. They did not appear in citations or commemorative speeches. They existed as absences, disasters that did not happen, losses that never materialized. And in war, those absences are the most meaningful victories of all. By the time the war turned decisively in the Allies' favor, the rule had already faded into the background. It was no longer controversial. It was no longer debated. It was simply how things were done. Bomber gunners engaged earlier now because that was what the manuals allowed and later encouraged. New crews learned the practice without being told where it came from or why it had once been forbidden. The sky had moved on, and so had the system. This is how most changes in war survive. Not through recognition, but through absorption. The principle that emerged from those desperate months in 1943 did not belong to one aircraft, one squadron, or one man. It became part of a broader understanding. Defensive systems cannot afford to wait for perfection. They must act early, disrupt intent, and force attackers to respond. That idea carried forward. When newer bombers entered service, their defensive doctrines reflected it. When post-war air defense systems were designed, the same logic appeared again: early detection, early engagement, disruption before execution. The language changed. The technology evolved, but the principle remained intact. Engage early. Deny the enemy control. The irony was that the rule's origin faded as its influence spread. It did not come from a research laboratory or a planning committee. It came from observation, fear, and the refusal to accept that following instructions was the same as surviving. The war moved on, as wars do. Veterans returned home. Records were filed away. New conflicts demanded new attention. The story of how bomber gunners reclaimed control of their own survival did not fit neatly into heroic narratives. There was no single battle to commemorate, no dramatic victory to point to, just a quiet shift that saved lives. The individuals closest to it rarely spoke about it. They did not frame their actions as innovation. They framed them as necessity. When rules fail under pressure, those who survive learn to adapt without waiting for approval. That lesson extends beyond air combat. Complex systems, military or otherwise, often optimize for measurable variables while ignoring human behavior. They reward compliance, they punish deviation, and they assume that correctness on paper translates to effectiveness in reality. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. The story of early aggressive fire in the bomber war is not a story about bravery alone. It is a story about judgment, about recognizing when a rule no longer serves its purpose, about understanding that survival often depends on acting before certainty arrives. The manuals taught patience. The sky demanded initiative. Those who learned that difference survived long enough for the system to catch up. By the time historians looked back, the change appeared inevitable. Loss rates declined. Fighter escorts arrived. The air war was won. It became easy to attribute success to technology and strategy, to machines and commanders. But between those forces lived something harder to quantify. Decision-making under pressure. Adaptation without permission. Control taken, not granted. The rule that once forbade early fire did not vanish because it was disproven mathematically. It vanished because reality rendered it irrelevant. Combat revealed what equations could not. That waiting for the perfect moment often hands that moment to the enemy. This is the uncomfortable truth that systems resist. Rules are designed to protect organizations. Judgment protects people. The bomber gunners of 1943 learned that lesson the hard way. They did not ask for credit. They did not seek recognition. They acted because hesitation was no longer an option. And because of that, hundreds of men returned home who otherwise would not have. That is the legacy. Not a name remembered, not a rule celebrated, but a quiet understanding passed forward through doctrine and practice that sometimes the difference between survival and loss is the courage to act before the rule book catches up. This story changed the way you think about war. Share it. Because history isn't shaped only by battles, but by the moments when people realized the rules were wrong,